The Case of the Stolen Portrait. Inspector Purbright, BBC radio drama. The annual Flaxborough Civic Pride Ceremony was, in its essence, an exercise in managed expectations. One did not attend expecting excitement, but rather a reaffirmation that things, for better or worse, continued. It was held, as always, in the town hall's main antechamber, a room whose chief personalities were the smell of floor polish and the faintly disapproving gaze of previous mayors immortalized in oil paintings, their varnished faces ranging in complexion from jaundiced to apoplectic, suggested they had all foreseen the town's gradual decline and were not in the least surprised by it. Today, however, a tangible frisson of something approaching anticipation circulated with the sherry. A new face was due to join the municipal gallery, that of the late Councillor Albert Grimsdyke. His portrait, commissioned at considerable expense, a point not lost on the ratepayers present, was concealed behind a heavy curtain of municipal burgundy velvet. Rigged to a cord and pulley system of dubious reliability, Mayor Hemlock, a man whose physique seemed designed specifically to test the load-bearing capacity of his gold chain of office, stood before the draped easel. He cleared his throat, producing a sound like gravel being reluctantly surrendered. "Friends, councillors, esteemed guests," he began, beaming a smile that did not quite reach his eyes. His eyes were busy scanning the room, assessing the quality of attention he was receiving. "We are gathered today not to mourn a loss, but to celebrate a legacy. A legacy of civic fortitude, of unwavering commitment." He paused, allowing the weight of these words to settle. Several councillors shifted in their squeaky chairs. Councillor Broadbent, Grimsdyke's staunchest and most vocal adversary for 2 decades, was seen examining a loose thread on his cuff with an intensity usually reserved for planning applications from developers. Albert Grimsdyke, Mayor Hemlock continued, warming to his theme, was a man of substance. He did not suffer fools gladly. This was, by Flaxborough standards, an almost recklessly accurate statement. Grimsdyke had not suffered anyone gladly, fool or otherwise. His primary mode of discourse had been a sort of belligerent grumble, as if perpetually annoyed that the world had failed to arrange itself for his personal convenience. He was, in short, a pillar of this community. The speech went on. It touched upon Grimsdyke's chairmanship of the planning committee, tactfully omitting the controversial car park development. It lauded his work on the Parks and Recreation subcommittee, gliding past the infamous incident involving the banned rhododendrons. It was a masterclass in civic eulogy, where the truth was not so much ignored as politely escorted to the door. Finally, the peroration arrived. And so, it is with immense pride in our town, and in the memory of a great public servant, that I unveil this lasting tribute. Mayor Hemlock grasped the tasselled cord. A collective shallow breath was drawn. The ladies of the Historical Society leaned forward. The editor of the Flaxborough Chronicle held his pencil poised. With a theatrical heave, the mayor pulled. The pulley squeaked in protest. The velvet curtain slid sideways with a soft shush and revealed nothing. Well, not precisely nothing. It revealed a patch of flock wallpaper, a shade darker than the surrounding area, where the portrait's frame had protected it from a century of accumulated dust and daylight. The brass plaque on the easel's ledge gleamed under the electric lights, its inscription crisp and clear. Councillor Albert P. Grimsdyke, 1955-2024. His eye was ever on the town's purse, but above it, where the great man's likeness ought to have been, there was only empty space for a full 10 seconds. The only sound was the faint hum of the radiator. The assembled citizens of Flaxborough stared, their faces a perfect study in British composure. It was not the gasp of shock one might find in a more demonstrative nation, but a unified, polite blink of utter disbelief. Mayor Hemlock's face, which had been a healthy port wine shade, deepened to something approaching the colour of the burgundy curtain. His hand was still on the cord, as if he believed a second pull might somehow correct the universe's sudden, inexplicable error. Councillor Broadbent, it was later noted, brought a handkerchief to his mouth. It was impossible to say whether it was to stifle a gasp of horror or a bark of laughter. "It appears," the mayor said, his voice strained into an unnatural calm, "that there has been a slight logistical impediment." He turned to the town clerk, a man whose expression suggested he had been fearing just such an impediment his entire professional life. "Mr. Aitken? An explanation, if you please." Mr. Aitken could only shake his head, his face a mask of bewildered terror. The silence was finally broken by a whisper from the back, a voice of pure, unadulterated civic delight. "Well," murmured Mrs. Petherbridge of the Historical Society, "I never. Albert's gone missing." The Civic Pride Ceremony did not so much end as dissolve. It disintegrated in a flurry of murmured apologies and sideways glances, the attendees dispersing with the quiet urgency of people escaping a bad smell. Information, however, abhors a vacuum, and the void left by Councillor Grimsdyke's portrait was filled instantly and entirely by rumour. The news did not need an official bulletin. It seeped from the town hall's stone walls and travelled on the afternoon breeze, carried by the most efficient conduits in Flaxborough, its leading citizens. Mrs. Petherbridge, her duty at the ceremony discharged, made straight for Mrs. Higgins's select tea room on the High Street. She moved with the gravitas of a bearer of state secrets. Inside, amidst the steam from the silver teapot and the gentle clatter of porcelain, she found her audience. "My dears," she began, her voice a conspiratorial whisper that carried to every corner of the room. "You will simply not credit it. Vandalism at the town hall." A scone, halfway to the mouth of Miss Trimble from the library, paused in mid-air. "Vandalism?" "Worse," Mrs. Petherbridge corrected, savouring the moment. "Disappearance. The portrait of poor Albert Grimsdyke. Vanished. Gone. The curtain was pulled and nothing. Just the wallpaper." A collective intake of breath rustled through the tea room. Theories bloomed like mould in a damp pantry. Was it a political statement? Young hooligans? Perhaps the artist, Mr. Smeaton, had reclaimed it in a fit of pique. "I did hear," offered Mrs. Goadby, whose husband was on the council, "that the likeness was not entirely flattering. More of a warning than a tribute, if you take my meaning." "Nonsense," retorted Mrs. Petherbridge, though she looked pleased with the suggestion. "It's a direct insult to the mayor, a protest, I've no doubt, from those who felt the expenditure was unwarranted." All eyes turned, as if by magnetic force, to the unspoken name of Councillor Broadbent. A similar, though less refined, conversation was unfolding in the smoky confines of the Chalice public house. Here the speculation was blunter. "Pinched it, has he?" chuckled Mr. Tidmarsh, the butcher, wiping froth from his moustache. "Good on him. Never liked Grimsdyke. Man had a face like a slapped flounder." The publican, polishing a glass, offered his own wisdom. "It's the principle of the thing. Ratepayers' money for a painting of a man who'd count the pennies in the collection plate." "Someone's made their point, I'll give them that." At that moment the door swung open and Councillor Broadbent himself entered. A wave of expectant silence fell over the bar. He seemed entirely unruffled, ordering a pint of bitter with the air of a man whose afternoon had proceeded exactly as planned. He met the inquiring looks with a bland smile. "Don't look at me," he said to the room at large. "I only wish I'd thought of it first." The ensuing laughter was loud, hearty, and did nothing to lessen anyone's suspicions. The official notification of the crime reached the police station somewhat later, lagging behind the town's gossip by a good 45 minutes. Sergeant Love, a man who believed in process and paperwork, took the call from a spluttering town clerk. He put the receiver down and walked, with a sense of profound weariness, into Inspector Purbright's office. The inspector was not contemplating the fragile nature of law and order, but was examining a photograph in the Flaxborough Chronicle of a prize-winning marrow. He looked up as Sergeant Love entered, his expression one of mild, academic inquiry. "Sir," Love began, choosing his words with care, "we have a situation. At the town hall." "Oh?" Purbright's voice was calm.
"Has the boiler expired again?"
"No, sir."
"It's a theft."
"Or a disappearance. Or possibly a prank of a municipal nature. And the victim?" Sergeant Love took a breath. "The portrait of the late Councillor Grimsdyke, sir. It's been
removed."
Inspector Purbright placed the newspaper carefully on his desk, aligning its edges with his blotter. He looked out of the window for a moment at the placid, unchanging rooftops of Flaxborough. He showed no surprise, no alarm, not even a flicker of irritation at the interruption. He merely looked thoughtful, as a botanist might upon discovering a familiar weed in an unexpected flower bed. "The late Councillor Grimsdyke," he repeated softly, as if tasting the name.
"I see. I suppose we ought to go and have a look at the space he no longer occupies." Inspector Purbright and Sergeant Love found the town hall antechamber in a state of suspended shock.
The velvet curtain was now neatly drawn back. The offending easel stood like a defendant in the dock, and the air was thick with the ghost of departed sherry and the far more potent aroma of municipal embarrassment. Mayor Hemlock was pacing beside the empty stand, his hands clasped behind his back, his movements those of a caged bear who has just discovered his dinner is missing. "Inspector," he boomed, stopping abruptly. "A scandalous affair.
An outrage.
This strikes at the very heart of civic order." "Indeed, Mr. Mayor," Purbright said, his tone gentle. He surveyed the scene, not as a policeman, but as a visitor to a slightly disappointing museum exhibit. "And when was the portrait last seen to be securely in its place?" "This morning. Filbert, our caretaker, saw it when he unlocked the room at 8. It was draped, of course, prepared. Everything was in order, decorous." The mayor seemed to find comfort in this word. Everything was proceeding with the dignity befitting the occasion. Sergeant Love, meanwhile, was conducting a more practical examination. He peered at the door, the window latches, the floor around the easel. "No sign of forced entry, sir," he reported, his voice flat. "Precisely," the mayor exclaimed, seizing on the point. "This was no common burglar. This was an inside job, Inspector. An act of calculated malice, a political gesture of the most vulgar sort." He did not need to specify the source of such vulgarity. His eyes flickered with a meaning as clear as a headline in the Chronicle. At that moment, a junior clerk entered bearing a tray with a pot of tea and 3 mismatched cups. The tea was poured, a brew of a dispiriting brown shade that suggested the leaves had been stewing since the crisis began. Purbright accepted a cup with a quiet, "Thank you." "Tell me about access to this room, Mr. Mayor," the inspector said, taking a thoughtful sip. The tea was, as he had suspected, both lukewarm and tannic. "Who has keys?" "The keys?" Mayor Hemlock waved a dismissive hand. "Mr. Aitken, the town clerk, has a set. Mr. Filbert has his master keys, and the main set is kept securely in the office safe. Security is paramount, Inspector. We are the custodians of the town's heritage." He puffed out his chest, a gesture somewhat undermined by the fact that a piece of that heritage had just walked out of the building. The room was locked until the guests began to arrive at 3 o'clock. "It was supervised at all times," Purbright nodded slowly, his gaze resting on the empty easel. "Supervised," he let the word hang in the air for a moment. "Thank you, Mr. Mayor, you've been most helpful. Perhaps now I might have a word with Mr. Filbert." The caretaker was found in his small subterranean office, a space that smelled of damp stone, pipe tobacco, and a lifetime of quiet responsibility. Mr. Filbert was a small, wiry man with a face as impassive as a worn flagstone. He did not seem surprised to see the police. "You wish to see me, Inspector?" "Mr. Filbert, just a few questions about the antechamber. You lock and unlock it each day?"
"I do," Filbert said. "Locked at 5 last night."
"Unlocked at 8 this morning. And the portrait was in place when you opened up? It was, covered with the curtain. I checked the cord was running free. He spoke with the precision of a man whose world was governed by routine. Any deviation was a matter of professional concern. And the key? Purbright asked, his voice casual. Where is it kept? Mr. Filbert's expression did not change, but he hesitated for a fraction of a second. The key for the antechamber is on the board in the clerk's office. A board? Aye, with the other keys. For the stationery cupboard, the meeting rooms, all labelled. So it is not kept in the safe, as the mayor suggested? A flicker of something, perhaps dry amusement, passed through Filbert's eyes. The main set of masters is in the safe, Inspector. The day-to-day keys hang on the board. They always have. And is the clerk's office kept locked? During the day, no people are in and out. Filbert seemed to feel this was a complete and sufficient answer. There was no judgment in his tone, merely a statement of fact. So anyone, a councillor, a member of staff,
a visitor with a query could potentially have walked into the office and borrowed the key for a few moments.
Mr. Filbert considered this. He took a long, slow pull from a pipe that wasn't there. If they'd a mind to, he said at last, and if they knew which key was which. Purbright thanked him and made his way back upstairs, Sergeant Love falling into step beside him. Sir, Love said, his brow furrowed. The mayor's version and the caretaker's don't exactly—
Align. No, Sergeant, Purbright replied, pausing at the scene of the crime.
One describes the world as it ought to be. The other describes it as it is. The truth, I imagine, lies somewhere in the gap between the two. By the following morning, the collective wisdom of Flaxborough had tried, convicted, and sentenced Councillor Broadbent. The verdict was not delivered in a courtroom, but over garden fences and shop counters, and it was unanimous. It was therefore no surprise to Inspector Purbright when he was summoned to the office of the Chief Constable. Chief Constable Stackpool was a man who appreciated straight lines, both in the crease of his trousers and in his criminal investigations. He liked clear motives, obvious suspects, and swift conclusions. The disappearance of the Grimsdyke portrait, in his view, possessed all three. "Morning, Purbright," he said, tapping a pencil on a file that was, as yet, mostly empty. "This business at the town hall, an open and shut case, I should think. Hemlock's been on the telephone, practically incandescent, all but name Broadbent. The man had motive, means, and a mouth on him the size of the town square. What's your assessment?" "The motive is certainly well established, sir," Purbright conceded.
As for the means, the key was accessible to a great many people. Nonsense, Stackpool clipped.
Accessible to a man who practically lives in the building, arguing in committees. He knew the routine, knew where the key was. It's as plain as a pikestaff. Have a chat with him.
Rattle his cage.
He'll confess soon enough. The council wants this resolved before it becomes a laughing stock. It may be a little late for that, sir, Purbright observed quietly. Well, get it sorted, Purbright. Neatly. Neatness. Purbright reflected as he and Sergeant Love made their way to Councillor Broadbent's premises was rarely a feature of human affairs. Broadbent was not a solicitor or an accountant, as one might expect of a councillor, but the proprietor of Broadbent's Baubles, a cramped antiques shop that smelled of beeswax and decay. The councillor was dusting a gloomy-looking grandfather clock with a feather duster, humming a tuneless melody. He looked up as the bell over the door tinkled, and a broad smile creased his face. "Inspector Purbright."
"And Sergeant Love, to what do I owe the honour?"
"Don't tell me you've found a buyer for that hideous portrait already. We were hoping you might be able to help us with our inquiries into its disappearance." "Councillor," Purbright said, his voice mild. "Disappearance." Broadbent boomed, setting down his duster. "Let's call a spade, Inspector. It was a liberation, a preemptive strike against a crime against aesthetics."
"An act of public service." His eyes twinkled with a defiant glee.
He was enjoying himself immensely. "An act of theft, according to the law," Sergeant Love interjected, his notebook poised. "Ah, the law," Broadbent sighed dramatically. "Such a blunt instrument. Tell me, Inspector, am I your prime suspect? Your long-standing and very public opposition to Mr. Grimsdyke, and to this portrait in particular, has been noted, Purbright said calmly. You made your feelings plain at the council meeting last month, I believe. A grotesque vanity was one phrase you used, and I stand by it. Broadbent declared, gesturing expansively and narrowly missing a display of porcelain shepherdesses. Albert Grimsdyke was a municipal tyrant who thought the town's chequebook was his personal property. Spending £2,000 of ratepayers' money to immortalise that sour face was the final insult.
I said it then and I say it now.
But saying it is one thing, Inspector. Doing something about it is quite another.
And you deny doing something about it?
Purbright asked. Deny it? Of course I deny it.
Do you take me for an idiot?
Stealing it would have been so
crude, so obvious. It points the finger directly at me, doesn't it?
If I wanted to cause trouble, I'd have tabled a motion or written a letter to the Chronicle.
Much more my style. He folded his arms, the very picture of righteous indignation. Can you tell us where you were yesterday afternoon, Councillor?
Love asked, his pencil scratching. Say between 1 o'clock and 3? I was right here, Broadbent said, slapping the grandfather clock. Stock-taking. A tedious but necessary task.
Alone, I'm afraid.
My assistant only works mornings. You'll have to take my word for it. I see, Purbright said. He wandered a few steps further into the shop, examining a tarnished silver trophy. You spend a good deal of time at the town hall. You must be familiar with its routines. The location of the keys, for instance. Broadbent's smile tightened almost imperceptibly at the edges.
I'm a diligent public servant, Inspector. I know my way around.
But I am not in the habit of helping myself to the stationery, let alone the fixtures and fittings. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have a valuation at noon.
Unless you intend to arrest me.
Not at present, no, Purbright said, turning back towards the door. He paused, his hand on the latch. Just one other thing, Councillor.
Had you ever seen the portrait?
The question seemed to catch Broadbent off guard.
Seen it? How could I?
It was kept under wraps, wasn't it? It was delivered last week, Purbright said, his tone still conversational. It sat in the antechamber for several days before the ceremony. Draped, as you say, but a drape can be easily lifted. For the first time, Councillor Broadbent looked genuinely unsettled. The theatrical bluster drained away, replaced by a sharper, more calculating expression.
I have no idea what you're talking about, Inspector. I never saw the wretched thing. As they stepped back into the street, Sergeant Love closed his notebook with a snap of satisfaction.
He's lying, sir. I'd wager my pension on it. He's as guilty as sin. He's certainly guilty of enjoying the situation, Sergeant, Purbright murmured, his gaze distant. Whether he is guilty of creating it, however, that remains to be seen. Leaving Councillor Broadbent to his triumphant indignation, Inspector Purbright did not return to the station. Instead, he directed Sergeant Love towards a cobbled lane behind the market square, a part of Flaxborough that had stubbornly resisted the 20th century. Their destination was a tall, narrow building with a large, grimy skylight in its roof. A small, peeling sign beside the door announced, Julian Smeaton, artist, portraits and landscapes. The man who answered their knock was tall and thin, with a plume of grey hair that suggested a long-running battle with a comb in which both sides had given up. He wore a paint-smeared smock over a tweed jacket and, despite the time of day, a cravat of a mournful purple hue. "Inspector," he said, his voice a reedy tenor of complaint. "I was wondering when you'd get around to me. The Creator is always the last to be consulted."
Come in, come in! Mind the canvases. The studio was one large room, chilly despite the electric heater glowing weakly in a corner.
It smelled powerfully of turpentine, oil and damp. Canvases in various states of completion were stacked against every wall, mostly gloomy landscapes of the local fen country and portraits of stern-faced farmers. A terrible business. "Mr. Smeaton," Purbright began, navigating a path between a pot of brushes and a half-eaten plate of toast. "A loss of your work?" "Loss?" Smeaton scoffed, picking a stray thread from his cravat. "It isn't the loss that concerns me, Inspector. It's the sheer ignorance.
The barbarism.
Do you have any idea of the craftsmanship involved? The layering of the glazes? The preparation of the gesso ground? To have it manhandled by some Philistine with a political grievance. He shuddered with genuine anguish. It's probably been rolled up and stuffed in a ditch. The craquelure will be utterly ruined. You don't believe it was stolen for its monetary value? Sergeant Love asked, his pen at the ready. Smeaton emitted a short, bitter laugh. My dear Sergeant, this is Flaxborough, not Florence. The council haggled me down to a fee that was frankly insulting. No, this was an act of pure, unadulterated vandalism.
An attack on art itself. What was Councillor Grimsdyke like as a sitter?
Purbright asked, his gaze drifting over a half-finished painting of a prize bull. A block of granite, Smeaton said instantly. No interior life whatsoever. Getting a flicker of personality out of him was like trying to strike a match on a wet sponge. I had to paint the public office, not the man. The illusion of gravitas. It was, if I say so myself, a technical triumph of form over content. He seemed rather proud of this achievement. Tell me about the painting itself, Mr. Smeaton, Purbright said. The physical object, the canvas, the frame, Belgian linen, the finest.
Stretched by my own hands.
The frame was a monstrosity chosen by the council's acquisitions committee. Gilt effect, looked like something off a fairground ride.
I argued against it, of course, but you can't give these people taste. And the paints?
The finish? A flicker of professional pride ignited in the artist's tired eyes. My materials are impeccable.
Old Holland oils. And for the final coat?
He leaned forward, his voice becoming confidential, the way a priest might speak of sacred rites. For the final coat, I used a special varnish. Robertson's amber varnish. Very traditional.
Very expensive. Had to order it specially from London. What's special about it?
Purbright asked, his interest apparently no more than polite curiosity. Everything, Smeaton declared. The luster, the durability, it gives the colours a depth, a luminosity you simply don't get with common mastic. It's made to a 19th century formula. Copal resin dissolved in spike lavender oil. He warmed to his subject, the artist overriding the victim, and has a very particular aroma when it's fresh. Faint, but quite distinct. A nutty, almost almond-like scent. Quite unique, I see, said Purbright. The observation seemed to pass without effect. He asked a few more routine questions about the portrait's delivery and installation at the town hall, to which Smeaton provided vague, uninterested answers. His part, it was clear, had ended the moment the final brushstroke was applied. Their interview concluded. Purbright and Love stepped back out into the lane. Well, that was a dead end, Love commented, closing his notebook. Another one with a grudge against the council, but not much practical help.
Almonds and lavender oil. What's that got to do with anything?
Perhaps nothing at all, Sergeant, Purbright said, his gaze fixed on the grey Flaxborough sky, and perhaps a great deal. A painting is more than just an image, after all. It's a physical thing. It carries its own little secrets. Inspector Purbright believed that to understand a man one should look not at his public monuments but at the home he kept. The following morning, he and Sergeant Love made what was described as a courtesy call on Mrs. Grimsdyke. The late councillor's house stood in a street of prosperous, self-satisfied villas, its facade as stern and unyielding as its former master. The front garden was a model of rigid order, with roses pruned to within an inch of their lives. The door was opened by the widow herself. Mrs. Grimsdyke was a woman of 60.
Her grey hair immaculately set, her posture erect.
She wore a simple black dress, but there was nothing of the distraught relict about her. Her expression was one of polite, neutral composure. She showed them into a living room that was less a space for living than for the display of possessions. Heavy mahogany furniture gleamed with a ferocious polish, and every ornament sat precisely in its designated place. The silence in the room was as heavy and as polished as the furniture. "Inspector," she said, her voice calm and clear, "I had expected you might call. Please sit down." "It is good of you to see us at such a difficult time, Mrs. Grimsdyke," Purbright began, settling into a chair that seemed actively to resent being sat upon. "We don't wish to intrude. It is no intrusion. My husband's life was a public one."
It seems his death and now this affair
"Are to be public also." There was no emotion in her voice. It was a simple statement of fact. "The theft of the portrait must have come as a second shock to you," Purbright ventured. Mrs. Grimsdyke looked directly at him, her eyes a cool, steady grey. "The portrait, Inspector, was my husband's project, not mine. Albert felt that his long service to Flaxborough deserved a permanent memorial. I did not always agree with him on the nature of memorials." The understatement was as profound as the silence that followed it. Sergeant Love shifted his feet, the sound unnaturally loud in the oppressive quiet. "Did you feel the portrait was a good likeness?" Purbright asked. "I believe Mr. Smeaton captured the man the council knew," she replied, with careful precision. "Whether that was the whole man is a matter for debate." "But then it wasn't painted for me," Purbright changed tack slightly. "Your husband was a successful man, a man of strong convictions. Such men sometimes make enemies." For the first time a faint, dry irony touched Mrs. Grimsdyke's lips.
"My husband did not believe in enemies, Inspector."
"He believed in people who were right and people who were wrong. He was always right. It simplified his view of the world. And were there many people he considered to be wrong?"
"A significant number," she said, her hands resting calmly in her lap.
Albert's business dealings, before he devoted himself to the council, were brisk. He believed a contract was sacrosanct. Sentiment had no place in commerce. Some found that difficult to accept. Can you think of anyone specific who might have held a long-standing grudge? She considered the question, not as if searching her memory, but as if selecting from a rather long list. There were disputes.
A builder he foreclosed on in the 70s.
A business partner he bought out for a sum the man later considered
inadequate. And family, of course. Family quarrels are always the most bitter. Family?
Purbright prompted. His cousin, Leonard Grimsdyke. They fell out years ago over the terms of their aunt's will.
Albert was the executor.
Leonard felt he had been poorly treated. There was a great deal of unpleasantness. My husband was a wealthy man, Inspector. A will can be a powerful source of grievance, both before and after it is read. She delivered this information without rancour, as if she were discussing the history of the house. It was clear that the portrait, to her, was merely a public symptom of the private vanity she had lived with for 40 years. Its theft was not a tragedy, but a vulgar piece of theatre that she was now being forced to attend. As they walked back down the obsessively neat garden path, Sergeant Love let out a low whistle. "Well, she won't be wearing black for long, I'd say." "Grief takes many forms, Sergeant," Purbright said, "and sometimes it takes the form of telling the truth after a lifetime of keeping up appearances." "So we have a new list of suspects," Love said, thinking aloud. "Disgruntled builders, ex-partners, a cousin named Leonard. We have a wider frame for the picture, certainly," Purbright agreed. "The question is whether the portrait was stolen because of who Councillor Grimsdyke was, or simply because of what he represented. Police work in Flaxborough was, for the most part, a matter of routine nuisances. It was therefore with no great sense of urgency that Sergeant Love took a call on Friday morning concerning a break-in at the municipal allotments. The complainant, a Mr. Dawlish, was reportedly in a state of high dudgeon. Inspector Purbright, who was contemplating the paradox of a town that loudly demanded economy while simultaneously complaining about a lack of civic grandeur, dispatched Love to soothe the aggrieved gardener. The allotments lay on the edge of town, a neat patchwork of vegetable beds and weathered sheds where the dramas of pest control and competitive marrow-growing unfolded. Sergeant Love found Mr. Dawlish, a man with a face like a winter root vegetable, standing guard over a small wooden shed.
His door hung slightly ajar. "About time,"
Mr. Dawlish grumbled.
"Look at that. Forced the lock."
"Clean as a whistle. Vandals!" Love dutifully inspected the hasp. The metal was bent, but it was a neat job. showing none of the splintered fury of casual hooliganism. "Was anything taken, Mr. Dawlish?"
"No," the man said, outraged.
"And that's the queer part. Didn't touch me new fork. Left the bag of fertilizer. Ignored a perfectly good tin of biscuits. What's the point of breaking in if you're not going to steal anything?"
"It's inefficient." Love stepped inside the shed.
It smelled, as all sheds do, of damp earth, creosote, and stored ambition. Sacks of compost were stacked against one wall, tools hung from hooks, and a string of desiccated onions swayed gently from a rafter. He could see Mr. Dawlish's point. There was nothing missing, nor was there any sign of malicious damage. It was as if someone had broken in, stood in the middle of the floor for a while, and then left. He was about to close his notebook and file the incident under pointless misdemeanors when he noticed two things. The first was the floor. Unlike the rest of the shed, which was cluttered, a large rectangular area in the center was conspicuously empty. The thick dust that coated the floorboards was disturbed. Within this area were 4 distinct impressions, little circular marks as if the corners of a heavy frame had rested there. He took out his tape measure. The rectangle the marks described was approximately 4 feet by 3. The second thing was the smell. It was very faint, almost lost, beneath the stronger odors of soil and wood treatment, but it was there, a sweet, nutty, slightly chemical scent. It was strangely familiar. Love sniffed the air again, and then he remembered the artist's studio, the fussy pride in Mr. Smeaton's voice, a nutty, almost almond-like scent. Quite unique. He suddenly felt the prickle of excitement that came when the loose, tangled threads of a case began to pull together. He thanked the still grumbling Mr. Dawlish and made his way back to the station, walking with a much brisker step. Purbright listened to the sergeant's report without comment, his fingertips steepled together. The dimensions, "Sir," Love said, consulting his notes, "are a near-perfect match for the portrait, according to the artist's specifications, and the smell, I'm certain of it, was the varnish Smeaton described. It seems the portrait was stashed in the shed for a short time." "Interesting," Purbright murmured.
"A temporary hiding place." "There's more, sir," Love added, with a touch of theatrical timing.
I checked the allotment register. The plot to the left of Dawlish's belongs to a Miss Petherbridge from the Historical Society.
"And the 2 plots to the right?"
"They're registered to Councillor Broadbent." This seemed, for a moment, to be the final damning piece of evidence. The obvious suspect had a shed mere yards away from where the stolen object had been hidden. It was almost too neat. "So Broadbent breaks into his neighbour's shed to hide the painting," Purbright mused aloud. "Why not use his own?" "To throw us off the scent, sir?" Love suggested. "Make it look like someone else?" "Perhaps," the inspector said, though he didn't sound convinced. His gaze went to the window, to the quiet, orderly life of the town unfolding beyond the glass. The theft of the portrait had been a bold, almost public gesture. This business with the shed felt different. It was furtive, complicated, and, like Mr. Dawlish's complaint, oddly inefficient. "Tell me, Sergeant," he said, his focus returning to the room, "this Mr. Dawlish, the man whose shed was used, does he have any connection to the late Councillor Grimsdyke?" The question seemed to come from nowhere.
Love blinked. "Dawlish? I don't know, sir. I can find out." "Do that," Purbright said softly.
"Let's not be too hasty to admire the view from just one window. It's often the little side paths that lead somewhere interesting." Late afternoon sunlight, thin and golden, slanted through the window of Inspector Purbright's office, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the still air. The day's paperwork was done. Sergeant Love had departed to investigate the connection, if any, between a grumpy allotment holder and a deceased councillor. The station was quiet. Purbright sat with a cup of tea, a beverage he treated less as a refreshment and more as a medium for contemplation. He stared not into the cup, but through it, towards the puzzle of the stolen portrait. He mentally reviewed the cast of characters, each with their own particular grievance. There was Councillor Broadbent, the political rival, whose motive was as plain and public as a campaign poster, a simple act of protest, of triumphant spite. Yet the details chafed against this neat conclusion. The secretive hiding of the painting in a neighbour's shed seemed unnecessarily elaborate for a man like Broadbent, who preferred the sound of his own voice in the council chamber to the scuffling of feet in a dark allotment. It lacked theatricality. Then there was the widow's list of casualties from her husband's life, the legion of the wronged. Any one of them might have harboured a desire to strike a posthumous blow, to erase the image of the man who had cost them so dearly. It was a powerful motive, the revenge of the vanquished. But again, the method felt wrong. A crime of pure hatred would surely have been more destructive.
A knife through the canvas in the dead of night, a splash of paint before the unveiling.
This careful, silent removal spoke not of passion, but of purpose. It was an abduction, not an assassination, and why steal it at all? This was the question that hummed beneath all the others. The portrait had no real value. Its theft brought no financial gain. Its only worth lay in its symbolism, and symbols could be interpreted in many ways. It was a symbol of civic pride to Mayor Hemlock, a symbol of wasteful arrogance to Councillor Broadbent, a symbol of a public falsehood to the widow. Purbright took a slow sip of tea. He considered the physical evidence, the small, hard facts in a case built largely on emotion, the key hanging openly on a board, the neat, professional manner of the portrait's removal, the distinct, almond-like scent of a very specific varnish, and the allotment shed, a strange, almost absurdly rustic interlude in the affair. None of these facts pointed towards a crime of anger. They suggested familiarity, planning, and a desire to avoid causing a mess. It was a tidy crime, almost a polite one. The inspector lowered his cup. He was looking at the problem from the wrong angle. Everyone, himself included, had assumed the motive was negative, to protest, to destroy, to deface. But what if the motive was, in its own peculiar way, positive? What if the goal was not to destroy the portrait, but to control it, to remove it from a place where it told a lie, perhaps to preserve it for a place where it might tell a different kind of truth? It was not an act against Albert Grimsdyke's memory, but an act driven by a different, competing legacy. It was a crime not of resentment, but of a strange and powerful form of loyalty. A loyalty to what? To a person?
To an ideal?
To the simple, unvarnished truth? The pieces began to shift in his mind, not yet clicking into place, but forming a new, more coherent pattern. The quiet caretaker, the proud artist, the dignified widow, the blustering rival, they were all orbiting the same empty space on the wall, and one of them had a different sense of gravity from the others. Purbright pushed his teacup aside. The reflection was over. A course of action had presented itself. It would not be an interrogation or an accusation, but something quieter, a simple gathering, a little conversation. One puts the right chemicals together in a flask, he thought, and sometimes, without any great heat, a reaction occurs. He reached for the telephone on his desk. Inspector Purbright's invitations were models of polite ambiguity. They requested the pleasure of the recipient's company at the town hall on Saturday morning for an informal gathering to review the progress of the ongoing inquiry. It was a request that could not be easily refused, and so at 11 o'clock they came. They gathered in the scene of the crime, the antechamber which Purbright had specifically requested. The empty easel had been removed, but its psychic imprint remained, making the space feel incomplete. Mayor Hemlock arrived first, flustered and officious, clearly under the impression that the meeting was for his benefit. Councillor Broadbent was next, his expression a carefully balanced mixture of wary defiance and civic duty. Mr. Smeaton, the artist, appeared resentful, as if the investigation were a personal affront to his schedule, while Mrs. Grimsdyke entered with the same quiet, unnerving composure she had shown in her own home. Sergeant Love stood by the door, notebook in hand, a silent pillar of officialdom. Purbright, the day's unlikely host, greeted them all with a calm, even-handed courtesy that did little to dispel the electric tension in the room. "Thank you all for coming," he began, once they were seated in a semicircle of unforgiving chairs.
"I know you're all busy."
"I won't keep you long. I simply feel we have reached a stage where consolidating our various perspectives might prove fruitful." This vague pronouncement was met with a suspicious silence. Mayor Hemlock cleared his throat. "Have you made an arrest, Inspector?" "We are pursuing a number of promising lines of inquiry," Purbright replied, a phrase which meant everything and nothing. "But before we proceed, I've taken the liberty of arranging for some refreshment." On cue, the door opened, and Mr. Filbert, the caretaker, entered carrying a large tray laden with a silver teapot, cups, and a plate of biscuits. He moved with his usual quiet efficiency, his face impassive. Purbright watched as he served each person in turn, a silent, almost invisible presence who nonetheless knew the building's secrets better than anyone. He poured a cup for Councillor Broadbent, who took it with a curt nod. He offered the biscuits to Mrs. Grimsdyke, who politely declined. Not a word was exchanged, yet the room was filled with the unspoken histories of their interactions. When Filbert had finished and retreated to a discreet corner, Purbright resumed. "Mr. Smeaton," he said, turning to the artist, "perhaps you could describe the portrait for us again. Not its artistry, but its physical nature, the materials you used." Smeaton, mollified by being addressed as the expert, launched into a technical description of the Belgian linen, the oak stretcher bars, the layers of primer. He spoke of the oils, the pigments, the slow methodical process of his craft. The others listened, or pretended to, sipping their tea. The atmosphere was that of a particularly awkward séance. "And the final layer, Mr. Smeaton?" Purbright prompted gently. "The varnish. Ah, the varnish," the artist said, his tone becoming reverent. "Roberson's amber, a very particular preparation, as I believe I explained to you, Inspector." "You did," Purbright confirmed. "And you mentioned it had a rather unique scent." "That's correct. Faint, quite distinct when fresh.
A hint of spike lavender oil and something else. A nutty note."
"Like bitter almonds." Purbright nodded slowly, his gaze sweeping across the faces of his guests. He let a beat of silence pass, a silence in which the only sound was the clink of the mayor's spoon against his cup. "It strikes me as a curious detail," the inspector said, his voice thoughtful and deceptively casual, "that a smell so distinctive could be present on such a large object, yet go completely unnoticed by the person who went to the trouble of removing it. It seems a remarkable oversight." He paused, looking directly at Mr. Filbert, who stood motionless by the wall. "Unless, of course, one was already familiar with it."
"One might even find it reassuring." Mayor Hemlock looked utterly baffled.
Broadbent gave a short, cynical snort as if dismissing the idea as police fantasy. Smeaton merely nodded, pleased that his varnish was receiving the attention it deserved. Mrs. Grimsdyke's placid expression remained unchanged, but Mr. Filbert, who had been a study in stoic invisibility, flinched. It was not a large movement. It was a mere flicker of the eyelids, a sudden rigidity in his posture, a tightening of the hand that rested on the back of a nearby chair. It was the involuntary reaction of a man who has just heard a secret known only to him spoken aloud in a room full of people. No one else seemed to notice, but Purbright saw it. He had his reaction. "Well," the inspector said, his tone brightening as if a difficult subject had been successfully navigated, "I believe that is all. Thank you again for your time."
"You have been a tremendous help." He rose, signalling the end of the meeting.
The guests, more confused than when they arrived, departed in a murmur of polite, bewildered goodbyes. When the room was empty, save for the two policemen, Sergeant Love turned to his superior. "Sir," he said, completely mystified, "what was all that about varnish and reassuring smells?" Just tying up a loose end, Sergeant," Purbright said, collecting the empty teacups. "I think we now have everything we need." As the door clicked shut behind the last of the departing guests, a profound quiet settled once more upon the antechamber. Mr. Filbert began to collect the used teacups with practiced, methodical movements. Purbright watched him for a moment before speaking. "Mr. Filbert," he said, his voice gentle. Could you spare us another minute? Sergeant Love and I would appreciate it. The caretaker paused, a cup and saucer in his hands. He did not look surprised. He placed the crockery carefully back on the tray and turned to face the two policemen, his expression as impassive as ever, but his shoulders seemed to have settled with a kind of weary resignation. This crime was never a complicated one, Purbright began, not as an accuser, but as a man calmly stating a series of facts. It only appeared so because we were looking for the wrong motive. We were looking for anger, for greed, for political theatre. But this wasn't about any of those things, was it? Filbert remained silent, his gaze fixed on a point somewhere over Purbright's shoulder. Let's start with the practicalities, the inspector continued.
Access. The key to this room hung on a public board.
Anyone could have taken it, but only someone intimately familiar with the daily life of this building would know when they could do so without being seen.
Only someone who belonged here would go unnoticed.
You belong here more than anyone, Mr. Filbert. You've belonged here for 45 years. Purbright gestured around the room. Then there is the method. The portrait was removed cleanly. No damage to the wall, the easel, or the frame. This was not the work of a vandal. It was the work of a careful man, a man who respects property.
A man who might force a lock on a shed, but would do it neatly, causing the minimum possible damage. Sergeant Love's pen had stopped moving.
He was simply listening, his brow furrowed in concentration. Which brings us to the allotment shed, Purbright said. That was a clever touch. Councillor Broadbent's shed was just 2 doors down. Perfect piece of misdirection. But why use Mr. Dawlish's shed? We did as you suggested, Sergeant, he said, glancing at Love. We inquired about Mr. Dawlish. It turns out he is Mr. Filbert's brother-in-law. And, as Mr. Filbert knew, Mr. Dawlish was away visiting his sister in Skegness for 3 days. His shed was the perfect, secure, temporary hiding place.
No one would be disturbed and no one would look in Mr. Filbert's own shed, just in case. The caretaker's gaze lowered slightly.
He looked at the tray of teacups as if they contained the answer to a long and difficult sum. But it was the varnish that provided the key, Purbright said softly. Mr. Smeaton was very proud of it. He told us of its unique almond-like scent. He assumed the thief wouldn't have noticed it, but I think he was wrong. I think you noticed it long before the theft, Mr. Filbert. The portrait sat here, draped, for several days. Every time you came in to dust or check the windows, that faint, unusual smell would have been here. It became part of the room. He paused, letting his next words settle. But you were familiar with that scent already, weren't you? Mr. Smeaton told us the varnish was made to a 19th century formula. It's a traditional varnish, used for restoration. The sort of thing a careful custodian would use to touch up the scuffed frame of an old painting. The sort of thing you would have in a tin in your office for maintaining the building's other portraits. This was the final, unarguable fact. Filbert's eyes closed for a brief second. You didn't steal the portrait because you hated Albert Grimsdyke, Purbright stated. You stole it because you respected his father. The silence that followed was absolute. Filbert finally looked at the inspector, and in his eyes was the deep, weary sorrow of a man whose private principles had been forced into the public domain. You started here as a boy, Purbright continued, his voice quiet, reconstructive. When Councillor Franklin Grimsdyke, Albert's father, was chairman of the council. He was a good man, by all accounts.
A genuine public servant.
A man you looked up to. His portrait hangs in the main chamber, doesn't it? I imagine you take great care of it. He was a gentleman, Filbert said. His voice was hoarse, rusty from disuse, and his son was not, Purbright said. His son was a bully and a braggart who forced the council to buy a monument to his own vanity.
And you couldn't stand it?
You couldn't stand to see that portrait, that lie, hung here in the same building as the portrait of his father. It was an insult to a memory you held dear, so you decided to remove it.
You didn't want to destroy it. Vandalism is not in your nature.
You simply wanted it gone. He had laid it all out. The simple human truth behind the whispers and the political posturing. What were you going to do with it, Mr. Filbert? He asked, his tone kind. His cousin, the caretaker said, his voice barely audible. Leonard Grimsdyke. The one Albert cheated out of his inheritance. He lives up in the Dales, I thought.
I thought he should have it.
He knew what Albert was. It belonged with someone who knew the truth, and that was it. The entire case. Not a conspiracy, but a quiet, desperate act of historical correction undertaken by a man of principle. Where is the painting now? Purbright asked. In the boiler room, Filbert answered, his shoulders slumping at last. Wrapped in a blanket, behind the old water tank. He looked at the inspector, a lifetime of quiet service ending in this quiet, dusty room. It wasn't right.
Him hanging here?
It just wasn't. The portrait of the late Councillor Grimsdyke was recovered from the boiler room without ceremony. It was, as Mr. Filbert had promised, wrapped carefully in a blanket, unharmed and smelling faintly of dust and warm pipes. Inspector Purbright supervised its transfer to a locked storage room, where it sat in the dark, an object of profound municipal embarrassment. There was no trial. There was not even a formal charge. Purbright had a long, quiet conversation with Chief Constable Stackpool, who then had a short, agitated conversation with Mayor Hemlock. The conclusion they reached was a masterpiece of administrative pragmatism. To prosecute a loyal public servant of 45 years standing for an act driven by a misplaced, albeit sincere, sense of historical duty would create a scandal far worse than the theft itself. It would be unseemly. It would be untidy. And so the official record was adjusted. Mr. Filbert, it was announced, had taken early retirement due to advancing years and a wish to spend more time with his brother-in-law's allotment. He was presented with a small pension and a carriage clock at a private ceremony attended only by the town clerk. The minutes of the next council meeting recorded that the matter of the portrait had been satisfactorily concluded, a phrase that covered a multitude of sins. The portrait itself presented a final, awkward problem. It could not be hung, but it could not simply be thrown away. On Purbright's quiet suggestion, Mayor Hemlock wrote a letter to Mrs. Grimsdyke, offering to return the portrait to the family. Mrs. Grimsdyke, in a coolly polite reply, stated that she had no room for it, but that the councillor's cousin Leonard had expressed an interest. And so, one Tuesday morning, the portrait was crated up and dispatched on a carrier's lorry to a remote farmhouse in the Yorkshire Dales, where it was finally hung in a place where its subject was understood perfectly. In his own way, Mr. Filbert had won. Life in Flaxborough resumed its steady, unhurried pace. The whispers in Mrs. Higgins's tea room eventually subsided, and the jokes in the chalice found new targets. Councillor Broadbent denied the satisfaction of being either a celebrated suspect or a vindicated rival, found the whole affair deeply unsatisfying and returned to complaining about planning regulations with renewed vigour. The blank space on the antechamber wall remained, a silent testament to the brief and troublesome existence of the Grimsdyke Commission. In his office, Inspector Purbright initialed the bottom of a newly typed report. "It still seems a funny way to go about things," Sergeant Love said from the doorway, his confusion over the case having settled into a permanent state of mild bewilderment. All that trouble for an old painting? "It was never about the painting, Sergeant," Purbright said, not looking up. "It was about whether a man's memory should be made of stone or of truth. In this instance, truth proved to be the heavier of the two." He pushed the completed file aside and picked up a fresh one from his tray. Its title was stark and unadorned: "The Theft of a Bicycle from the Railings of the Public Library." Purbright opened the file. There was work to be done. Thanks for watching the video. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe.